I remember the taste of copper in my mouth when they first told me I had been chosen. The words came from Adept Merrick, delivered in that monotone voice all administratum clerks seemed to perfect after their first decade of service. Citizen Darius Kane, you have been selected for the Emperor's sacred service. He did not look up from his data slate when he spoke. His augment eyes softly as it processed the information scrolling across the screen. The sound reminded me of the grinding wheels in the manufactorum where I had worked for the past 15 years. I stood there in the gray processing chamber, bare feet cold against the metal floor, and tried to understand what those words meant. Sacred service. I had heard whispers, of course. Every citizen of Sanctum Prime knows there are those who disappear into the depths of the Imperial Palace, never to return. We tell ourselves they are blessed. We tell ourselves they serve a purpose greater than any of us can comprehend. We tell ourselves many things to sleep at night. The copper taste grew stronger. I realized I had bitten my tongue. There must be some mistake, I said, though my voice sounded small in the echoing chamber. I am just a factory worker. I maintain the grinding wheels for wheat processing in Sector Delta 5. I have no special skills. No training. No, there is no mistake. Adept Merrick finally looked up. His human eye was brown, tired, surrounded by the pale skin of someone who had not seen natural light in decades. The selection process is thorough. Your genetic markers, your psychic resonance levels, your psychological profile, all have been reviewed and approved. You will report to Sanctum Level Omega 33 at the 19th hour for preparation. The chamber felt smaller suddenly. The walls, painted that institutional beige that exists nowhere in nature, seemed to press inward. The fluorescent lumens hummed overhead with a frequency that made my teeth ache. I became aware of my breathing, how shallow it had become, how the recycled air tasted of metal and disinfectant. What exactly is sacred service? I asked. For the first time, something almost resembling emotion flickered across the adept's face. It might have been pity. It might have been envy. You will sustain the light that guides humanity through the darkness, he said. There is no greater honor. He returned to his data slate, and I understood the conversation was over. The journey from the processing chamber to my hab unit took 47 minutes through the transport tubes. 47 minutes, during which I stared at my reflection in the scratched plaster windows and tried to reconcile the face looking back at me with the words I had just heard. Chosen, selected, sacred service. The terms felt foreign, like a language I had once known but forgotten. My reflection was unremarkable. 34 years old, brown hair that had started thinning at the crown, gray eyes that held no particular wisdom or strength, a thin scar across my left cheek from a grinding wheel accident 3 years prior, hands calloused from decades of manual labor, fingernails permanently stained with machine oil, despite my best efforts to clean them. An ordinary man leading an ordinary life in service to the Imperium, or so I had thought. The hab unit was as I had left it that morning, a single room, 8 meters by 6, containing a cot, a small desk, a food preparation unit, and a lavatory alcove. The walls were the same institutional beige as the processing chamber. On the desk sat a single picked frame containing an image of my parents, both long dead, taken on the day they had been wed 47 years ago. They smiled at the camera, with the genuine happiness of people who believed the future held promise. I sat on the edge of the cot and stared at their faces. What would they think of their son's sacred service? Would they be proud? Terrified? I realized I did not know what to think myself. The remaining hours passed strangely. I tried to eat, but found no appetite. The corpse starch ration flavored, to approximate some long-extinct meat, turned to ash in my mouth. I tried to read from the small collection of approved texts I kept in my desk drawer, but the words swam before my eyes without meaning. The Prima Imperialis, which I had read hundreds of times, might as well have been written in an alien tongue. I tried to sleep but found myself staring at the ceiling panels, counting the small imperfections in the metal plating. 63 dents, 12 rust spots, one panel slightly misaligned with its neighbors. When the chime sounded for the 19th hour, I was ready. The transport system that carried me to Sanctum Level Omega 33 was unlike anything I had experienced in my years on Sanctum Prime. Most citizen transport tubes were utilitarian affairs designed to move large numbers of people efficiently through the hive city's endless corridors. This was different. The capsule was smaller, lined with what appeared to be actual wood, rather than the synthetic materials I was accustomed to. Brass fittings gleamed in the soft yellow light, and the air smelled of incense, rather than recycled atmosphere. There were 7 other passengers in the capsule with me, all of us selected for sacred service, all of us trying to process what that meant. We sat in silence, each lost in our own thoughts, our own fears, our own attempts to understand the magnitude of what was happening to us. The woman across from me was young, perhaps 25, with a pale complexion and slightly hunched posture of someone who spent their days bent over data slates in the administratum's endless filing chambers. Her hands shook as she clutched a small pendant in the shape of the imperial aquila. When she noticed me watching, she offered a weak smile that did not reach her eyes. "Lydia Knox," she said softly. "Data analyst, 3rd class, Sector Alpha 8. Darius Kane," I replied. "Maintenance technician, Delta 5. The elderly man beside her looked up from his own contemplation. His hands bore the distinctive burn scars of someone who had worked with Promethium for decades. "Victor Stone," he said, in a voice roughened by years of breathing industrial fumes. "Fuel processor, been in the deep works for 38 years. Figured I'd die down there among the pipes and burners. Never expected this." One by one, the others introduced themselves. Sarah Cross, a young woman barely 18, who had been working in the textile manufacturer since childhood. Anton Reeves, a middle-aged man whose augmentin marked him as a former tech servitor operator. Tobias Gray, a teenager whose nervous energy suggested he had been pulled from one of the lower hive's youth brigades. Mara Ridge, an older woman whose lined face spoke of years in the agrodomes, coaxing life from Sanctum Prime's poisoned soil. Ordinary people, workers, the backbone of the Imperium's vast industrial machine. None of us heroes, none of us particularly special. Just citizens who had somehow drawn the attention of the selection algorithms that govern such things. "Do any of you know what sacred service actually entails?" asked Anton, his augment fingers tapping nervously against his thigh. No one answered immediately. Finally, Victor spoke up. "My grandfather used to tell stories," he said, "back when he was young, before the purges of He claimed to know someone who knew someone who had worked in the deep levels of the palace. Said there were places down there where they fed souls to machines, where they turned people into batteries for things too terrible to name." "That's just superstition," Lydia said, though her voice lacked conviction. "The Emperor protects us. Whatever we're called to do, it serves a purpose." "All service serves a purpose," Sarah replied quietly. "That doesn't mean we survive it." The transport capsule began to descend more rapidly. Through the small windows, I could see the architecture changing as we went deeper. The utilitarian corridors of the upper hive gave way to more elaborate construction. Stone replaced metal. Gothic arches soared overhead, carved with symbols that seemed to writhe when viewed directly. The air grew thicker, heavy with incense, and the ozone smell of high-energy machinery. We were entering the true heart of the Imperial Palace, now the domain of the Adeptus Mechanicus, where technology and faith merged into something that transcended both. Servo skulls drifted past the windows, their eye sockets glowing red in the dim light. Occasionally we passed chambers filled with massive machines, whose purpose I could not begin to guess. Pipes thick as hablock corridors carried fluids that glowed with their own light. Cables the size of transport tubes, pulsed with electrical current, and everywhere carved into every surface, painted on every wall, etched into every piece of machinery, was the symbol of the Imperial Aquila, the two-headed eagle that represented humanity's dominion over the galaxy. Its wings spread wide, its heads turned to watch both the past and the future. But down here in the depths, the symbol seemed different somehow, more predatory. As if the eagle was not protecting humanity so much as preparing to devour it. The descent continued for what felt like hours, past foundries that glowed with the heat of artificial suns, past libraries where servo-scribes recorded information on scrolls of human skin, past chambers filled with vat-grown creatures that I tried not to look at too closely. The deeper we went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The weight of 10 millennia of accumulated faith and technology pressed down on us like a physical thing. Finally, the transport came to rest with a soft pneumatic hiss. Beyond the doors lay a corridor that stretched away into shadows, lined with statues of saints I did not recognize. Their faces were twisted in expressions of ecstasy and agony, their hands reaching towards something unseen. Lumens flickered in alcoves, casting dancing shadows that made the statues appear to move. "Citizens," came a voice from outside the transport. "You will disembark. You will follow. You will not speak unless spoken to." The voice belonged to a figure in red robes, a tech adept of the Mechanicus, whose face was hidden behind a brass mask shaped like a human skull. His movements were precise, mechanical, as he gestured for us to exit the transport. Other robed figures waited behind him, silent and still as the statues that lined the corridor. We followed them through passages that seemed to stretch forever. The air grew thicker with each step, heavy with the smell of sanctity and electricity. The sounds of the palace pressed in around us, the distant hum of massive generators, the chanting of tech priests performing their rituals, the whisper of servo skulls passing overhead, and underneath it all, so low it was felt rather than heard, a deep thrumming that seemed to come from the very foundations of the structure, the heartbeat of something vast and terrible. We passed through checkpoints guarded by skittery rangers, their augmented limbs clicking and worry as they scanned us with devices I did not recognize. Each checkpoint took us deeper into the palace, further from the world I had known, closer to whatever fate awaited us in the depths. The corridors began to change again. The Gothic arches gave way to something older, more primitive. Rough-hewn stone replaced worked marble. The carvings became less elaborate, but somehow more disturbing. Symbols that hurt to look at directly. Faces that seemed to watch us as we passed. Words in languages that had been old when Sanctum Prime was young, and still we descended. The air itself seemed to thicken, taking on an almost liquid quality that made breathing an effort. The temperature fluctuated wildly, scorching heat giving way to bone-deep cold without warning. The lumens flickered more frequently, sometimes leaving us in darkness for long moments before sputtering back to life. It was in one of these dark moments that I heard something that chilled me to the bone. A sound so low it was barely audible, yet so filled with anguish that it seemed to reach directly into my soul and squeeze. It lasted only a moment before the lumens returned, and the tech adepts continued their measured pace. But I knew I would carry the memory of that sound, for whatever time remained to me. It was the sound of someone screaming, in a place too deep for sound to carry. We came at last to a massive archway flanked by 2 custodian guards. Even motionless, even silent, they radiated a presence that made my breath catch in my throat. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were something beyond human, crafted by the Emperor's own hand, to be perfection made manifest. Their golden armor gleamed, despite the dim light, and their guardian spears hummed with barely contained energy. They did not acknowledge our presence. They did not need to. Their very existence was acknowledgement enough that we had reached a place of supreme importance. Beyond the archway lay a circular chamber with a domed ceiling that disappeared into shadows above. The walls were lined with alcoves, each containing a smaller version of what dominated the center of the room. Thrones, dozens of them, arranged in concentric circles around a raised dais. And on that dais stood something that made my mind recoil in instinctive terror. A throne larger than the others, more elaborate, more terrible. It was carved from some black substance that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Cables and tubes snaked away from its base, disappearing into the floor and walls. Crystalline structures grew from its arms and back, like malignant tumors pulsing with their own internal light. And connected to those smaller thrones sitting in them were people. They were alive, I realized with dawning horror. Their chests rose and fell with the rhythm of breathing. But their eyes stared sightlessly ahead, rolled back to show only the whites. Cables ran from the thrones into their bodies, needles and tubes piercing their arms, their necks, their skulls. The crystalline growths from the central throne had spread to encompass them as well, forming a web of glowing filaments that connected each occupant to the whole. They were not dead. They were something worse than dead. They were part of the machine. "Behold," said one of the tech adepts, his vox grill making his voice sound like it came from the bottom of a deep well. "The preparatory chambers for sacred service. Here, the faithful are transformed. Here, individual existence ends, and true purpose begins." Lydia began to cry, soft, quiet sobs that echoed strangely in the domed space. Victor reached out and took her hand, though his own was trembling. The teenager, Tobias, had gone pale as corpse starch, his mouth hanging open as he stared at the occupied thrones. "What happens to them?" Sarah whispered. The tech adept turned his skull mask toward her. They'd become part of something greater. Their life force, their psychic potential. Their very souls are channeled into the great work. They sustain the light that guides humanity through the darkness. "The Astronomicon," I breathed, understanding, flooding through me like ice water. Indeed, the beacon that allows our ships to navigate the warp, that keeps the forces of chaos at bay, that maintains the barriers between reality and the realm of nightmares. It requires constant feeding, constant sacrifice. The souls of the faithful willingly given, transformed into the light that preserves our species. The truth of it hit me like a physical blow. I had heard of the Astronomicon, of course. Every citizen of the Imperium knew of the great light that shone from Holy Sanctum Prime, guiding our ships through the treacherous currents of the warp. But I had never connected it to this. Never understood that the light was literally made from human souls burned away to fuel something beyond comprehension. 1,000 souls a day, the tech adept continued, his mechanical voice devoid of emotion. "For 10,000 years, the price of our survival paid in the currency of human life. You have been selected to join that number, to add your essence to the great beacon, to become part of the Emperor's will made manifest. 1,000 souls a day. The mathematics of it were staggering. Over 10 millennia, billions of people had sat in chairs like these, Billions of ordinary citizens pulled from ordinary lives, transformed into something that existed beyond the boundaries of flesh and mortality, all to keep a single light burning in the darkness of space. "How do you choose?" asked Anton, his augment arm worry softly as he clenched and unclenched his fist. "How do you decide who lives and who dies?" "The selection is thorough," replied the tech adept. "Genetic markers indicating psychic potential, psychological profiles suggesting stability under stress, physical conditions that allow for optimal energy transfer, age ranges that provide the greatest yield. The algorithms consider thousands of variables to identify those best suited for sacred service. Best suited to die, he meant best suited to be consumed by something that had once been human, but was now so far beyond humanity that it might as well be an alien god." "And if we refuse?" asked Mara, her weathered face set in stubborn lines. The tech's mask turned toward her with mechanical precision. "Refusal is not possible. The selection has been made. The Emperor's will cannot be denied. You may approach your transformation with acceptance and find peace in service, or you may resist and find only suffering. The outcome remains the same." I looked around the chamber again, taking in the full scope of what awaited us. Dozens of thrones, all occupied. Dozens of people who had once been like us, now reduced to empty shells connected to a machine that fed on their essence. And in the center, that terrible black throne that pulsed with its own malevolent life. "The central throne is different," I observed. "Indeed, it serves as a focusing mechanism, channeling the combined psychic energy of all connected souls and directing it toward its intended purpose. It also houses the intelligence that coordinates the entire process." "What intelligence?" For the first time, something almost resembling uncertainty flickered in the tech adept's mechanical voice. "The fragment of the Emperor's consciousness assigned to oversee this facility, a portion of his divine intellect severed from the whole and tasked with the management of sacred service. It has been changed by its proximity to the process. 10,000 years of witnessing the death of the faithful has affected it in ways we do not fully understand." The implications sent a chill through me. A piece of the Emperor's mind, isolated down here in the depths, watching thousands die every day for 10 millennia. What would such an experience do to any consciousness, even a divine one? What would it become after witnessing so much death, so much suffering, all in service of a greater purpose? "You will be processed in order of selection," the tech continued, gesturing toward the waiting thrones. "The procedure is brief but intensive. Your individual consciousness will be preserved for a short time as your body adapts to the neural interfaces. After that, you will become part of the greater whole." Lydia was first. They led her to one of the smaller thrones, with the same mechanical precision they showed in all things. She walked slowly, as if in a dream, her hands clutching the Aquila pendant so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. When they helped her sit, she looked back at us with eyes wide with terror. "Tell them," she whispered. "Tell them I served willingly. Tell them I died with honor." But there would be no one to tell. We were all destined for the same fate. The needles slid into her arms with surgical precision. Tubes connected to her neck, her spine, her skull. The crystalline growths from the central throne began to extend toward her, reaching out like hungry fingers. When they made contact, her entire body convulsed as if struck by lightning. Her scream echoed through the chamber, a sound of pure agony that seemed to go on forever. Then, suddenly, it stopped. Her face went slack, her eyes rolling back to show only the whites. The readings on the tech adept's instrument spiked, then settled into a steady rhythm. "Connection established," one of them announced. "Soul integration at 97% efficiency. Psychic resonance within acceptable parameters." Lydia, data analyst 3rd class from Sector Alpha 8, ceased to exist as an individual entity. What remained was a conduit, a living battery feeding power into the great machine that kept humanity alive. Victor went next. The old fuel processor faced his fate with stoic dignity, settling into his assigned throne without resistance. "Worked with fire all my life," he muttered as the needles found their marks. "Fitting that I should become fire in the end." His transformation was quieter than Lydia's, but no less final. One moment he was a man with decades of experience and accumulated wisdom. The next he was part of the machine. Sarah followed, then Anton, then the boy Tobias, who wept silently as the crystalline filaments invaded his nervous system. Each transformation was slightly different, each individual reaction unique, but the result was always the same. Consciousness dissolved into something larger, identity subsumed into collective purpose. Mara, the agrodome worker, was the last before me. She looked at the throne with undisguised hatred, her weathered hands clenched into fists. 40 years I spent trying to make things grow in poisoned soil, she said. 40 years fighting to bring life to a dead world. And this is my reward. Your reward is eternal service. The tech adept replied without emotion. Your essence will guide ships across the galaxy. Your sacrifice will preserve millions of lives. What greater purpose could any individual serve? The purpose of living, she spat. But she sat in the throne anyway, because there was no choice. Her transformation was the most violent yet. Her body convulsing for long minutes before finally going still. But even in death, even connected to the machine, something of her defiance seemed to remain. The readings fluctuated more wildly than the others, as if some part of her consciousness was still fighting. And then it was my turn. The throne was warm when I settled into it, heated by some internal mechanism, or perhaps by the psychic energy flowing through the chamber. The material felt organic somehow, as if it were made from living tissue, rather than metal or stone. As the restraints closed around my arms and legs, I caught a glimpse of the central throne, and realized with horror that I could see something moving within its crystalline matrix. A face, human, but transformed by 10,000 years of exposure to forces beyond mortal comprehension. The fragment of the Emperor's consciousness that oversaw this facility, trapped within the machine, watching everything with eyes that held the accumulated weight of millions of deaths. Those eyes turned toward me as the first needle slid home. The pain was indescribable. Not physical pain, though that was certainly present, but something deeper. The pain of having your very essence torn apart and examined, categorized, prepared for consumption. I felt my memories being sifted through by an intelligence vast and alien, and utterly indifferent to my suffering. My first day at the manufacturum, the pride I had felt when I successfully repaired a particularly complex grinding mechanism. The girl I had loved for 3 perfect weeks before she was transferred to another sector. The taste of real meat on Foundation Day. A rare treat in a life of processed protein. The sound of rain on the Hablock roof during one of Sanctum Prime's infrequent storms. All of it catalogued, filed away, prepared for integration into the greater whole. But there was something else in the examination. A presence that felt different from the cold analytical intelligence that was processing my memories. Older, more human, infinitely sad. The fragment of the Emperor's consciousness trapped within the central throne was not just observing the process. It was participating in it, adding its own sorrow to the transformation. Each death diminished it somehow. Each new soul added to the choir took something away from what it had once been. I am sorry, it whispered directly into my dissolving mind. I am so very sorry. The voice was not the mechanical drone of the tech adepts, or the inhuman majesty I had expected from anything connected to the Emperor. It was the voice of a man who had seen too much, endured too much, sacrificed too much in service of a cause that demanded ever greater sacrifices. Why? I managed to ask, though whether I spoke the word aloud or simply thought it, I could not tell. Images flooded my consciousness in response. The galaxy, as seen from the perspective of the Golden Throne. Millions of worlds spinning in the darkness. Each one precious, each one fragile. Ships moving through the warp, guided by the light of the astral. Colonies being founded on distant worlds. Children being born under alien suns. Humanity spreading across the stars, carrying the spark of consciousness to every corner of the galaxy, and pressing in from all sides. The enemies that sought to extinguish that spark. Chaos fleets massing in the Eye of Terror. Tyrannid hive ships, approaching from the dark between galaxies. Orc warbands, gathering momentum as they swept across entire sectors. Ancient Necron tomb worlds awakening, after millions of years of slumber. The choice was not between good and evil, between freedom and oppression, between hope and despair. The choice was between survival and extinction, between the continuation of human consciousness and its complete obliteration. The price is too high, I protested, even as I felt my individual identity beginning to fray at the edges. Yes, agreed the voice in my head. It is, but the alternative is worse. More images. A galaxy without the Astronomican ships lost in the warp. Their crews driven mad by exposure to raw chaos. Worlds cut off from each other, falling one by one to enemies they could not defeat alone. The great civilization of humanity crumbling into isolated fragments. Each one preyed to forces that had waited millennia for this moment of weakness. And worse, visions of what would happen to human souls after the fall. Not death, which would be a mercy, but eternal torment in dimensions where the very concept of suffering had been refined to an art form. Consciousness preserved in agony. Experiences stretched across eons of pain. The human spirit broken and remade into something that existed only to suffer. This is the choice we face, the voice continued. Heavy with the weight of 10,000 years of accumulated guilt. Sacrifice the few to preserve the many, or lose everything to forces that know no mercy, no compassion, no limits to their cruelty. I have made that choice 10 million times. I will make it 10 million more. I understood then the Emperor's fragment trapped within the machine was not some cold, calculating intelligence, sorting through human lives like data points. It was the embodiment of an impossible burden, the consciousness that had to choose who lived and who died every single day. It felt every death, knew every name, remembered every face. And it endured because someone had to make those choices, and no one else was capable of bearing the weight. Will it ever end? I asked as my sense of self continued to dissolve. The pause before the answer told me everything I needed to know. I don't know, it admitted. I hope so. I pray for it every moment of every day. But hope is not enough. Prayer is not enough. Only sacrifice is enough. My individual consciousness was almost gone now, absorbed into the greater choir of souls that powered the astral. But in those final moments, I felt something unexpected. Not the cold emptiness I had feared, but warmth, connection, purpose. I was becoming part of something larger than myself, something that mattered in ways I had never imagined possible. The fear faded, the pain faded. What remained was a sense of belonging that I had never experienced in life. I could feel the other souls in the choir, all of us connected by threads of psychic energy that pulsed with our combined will. Lydia was there, her analytical mind helping to coordinate the flow of information. Victor, his steady presence providing stability to the entire network. Sarah, Anton, Tobias, Mara, all of them contributing their unique essence to the greater whole. And there were others, thousands of others, millions of others, all of us burning together in a symphony of sacrifice that stretched back 10,000 years to the very founding of the Imperium. Farmers and soldiers, scholars and laborers, children and elders, all united in service to something greater than any individual life. We were the astral. From our new perspective, I could see the galaxy spread out like a vast three-dimensional map. Every world that flew the Imperial banner glowed with its own light, connected to every other world by the web of warp routes that made travel possible. Ships moved along those routes like blood cells through arteries, carrying cargo and passengers, information and hope from one star system to another, and guiding them all was our light, the beacon that we had become, shining out from Holy Sanctum Prime with an intensity that could be perceived across the entire galaxy. Without us, those ships would be lost in the warp, their navigators blind to the currents and storms that could destroy them in an instant. Every safe arrival was a victory paid for with our souls. Every successful voyage was bought without deaths. Every world that remained connected to the greater Imperium was sustained by our sacrifice. But we were more than just a navigation aid. We were part of the Emperor's will, made manifest, an extension of his consciousness that reached into every corner of human space. Through us, he could perceive threats that might not be visible from Sanctum Prime. Through us, he could intervene in crises that might otherwise destroy entire worlds. I felt his attention touch our collective consciousness, vast and terrible and utterly alien. 10,000 years of existence, beyond the boundaries of mortality, had changed him into something that could barely be called human anymore. His thoughts moved on scales of time and space that mortal minds could not comprehend. His concerns encompassed not just humanity, but the fundamental structure of reality itself. Yet, there was still something recognizably human at his core, a fragment of the man he had once been, preserved like an insect in amber within the divine consciousness. That fragment mourned every soul that fed the astral. It remembered what it was like to be mortal, to have hopes and dreams and fears that mattered on a personal level. And it was grateful, not the cold gratitude of a ruler acknowledging useful service, but the warm personal gratitude of someone who understood the magnitude of the sacrifice being made. He knew our names, our histories, our small hopes and simple dreams. He remembered the girl I had loved, and the taste of real meat, and the sound of rain on. He carried all of it within his vast consciousness. A library of human experience that grew larger with every soul added to the choir. We were not just fuel for his great work. We were reminders of what he was fighting to preserve. Every memory we brought with us was another reason to continue the struggle. Another small piece of the human experience that deserved protection. The days and weeks that followed, if such terms had any meaning in our new existence, were a revelation. I learned to perceive the galaxy through the lens of the Astromkin, to feel the pulse of human civilization across a million worlds. Ships called out for guidance, and we provided it. Our light cutting through the darkness of the warp like a blade through silk. Colonies requested aid, and the Emperor's attention flowed through us to assess their needs, sometimes dispatching help across thousands of light years with a thought. But I also saw the darkness that pressed in from all sides. Chaos fleets gathering in the Eye of Terror, their hulls twisted into shapes that hurt to perceive directly. Demon princes marshalling their forces for another assault on the material universe. Heretic cults spreading their poison through loyal imperial worlds, preparing the way for invasion from within. The Great Devourer, approaching from the galactic rim. Its scout fleets probing the outer systems, while the main hive fleets digested entire star clusters in their wake. Splinter fleets that had broken off from the main swarms, each one capable of consuming entire sectors before they could be stopped. Orc empires consolidating their gains, their war bosses growing more cunning with each victory. Wars that started as raiding parties and grew into unstoppable tides of destruction, sweeping away everything in their path. Ancient Necron tomb worlds awakening after eons of slumber, their occupants emerging to reclaim a galaxy they considered theirs by right of prior ownership. Technologies that made human science look like a child playing with sticks wielded by consciousnesses that had survived the death of their own gods. And worse things that existed in the spaces between dimensions, pressing against the barriers that kept them at bay. Things that fed on reality itself, growing stronger with every breach in the walls between worlds. Things that whispered promises of power to those foolish enough to listen, always demanding just a little more, just one more compromise until their victims were completely consumed. The Emperor saw all of it, every threat, every crisis, every small victory and crushing defeat. His consciousness stretched across the galaxy like a web, touching every world that bore his name, every ship that flew under his banner, every soul that knelt in prayer before his image. And somehow, impossibly, he held it all together, not through force alone, though his power was beyond mortal comprehension, not through fear, though his enemies had good reason to dread his attention. He held it together through will, through the absolute refusal to surrender, no matter how hopeless the situation became, through the determination to protect humanity, even if it meant becoming something that humanity might no longer recognize as one of their own. The irony was not lost on him. I could feel his awareness of it in the moments between crises. In the brief pauses, when his attention was not focused on some distant emergency, he had become the very thing he had once sought to destroy. A god emperor, demanding worship from his subjects. A tyrant sustained by the blood of innocence. A monster wearing the face of humanity's savior. But he was still humanity's savior, monster or not. Because the alternatives were worse. Because someone had to make the impossible choices. Because 10,000 years of experience had taught him that sometimes the only way to preserve something precious was to sacrifice everything else. We felt his grief in those quiet moments. The accumulated weight of 10 millennia of necessary atrocities. The knowledge that every day of survival came at a cost that no sane being would willingly pay. The understanding that he had long since crossed lines that could never be uncrossed. Committed acts that could never be forgiven. And yet he endured for us. For the species that had birthed him, and then demanded that he become something beyond their comprehension. For the future that might still be possible, however distant it seemed. Through our connection to the Astromont, I began to understand the true scope of the eternal war that raged across the galaxy. Not the simple narrative of good versus evil that was taught in the Imperial Creed, but something far more complex and terrible. A struggle between different concepts of existence itself, fought on scales that dwarfed individual lives, individual worlds, even individual species. The forces of chaos sought to drag the material universe into the warp to transform reality into an endless nightmare, where emotion and will shaped the fundamental laws of physics. They offered power and freedom, but at the cost of sanity and ultimately existence itself. What they called liberation was actually the dissolution of everything that made consciousness meaningful. The Tyranids represented a different kind of extinction, not the chaotic dissolution of reality, but its complete consumption. They would devour every world, every life form, every scrap of organic matter, leaving behind only empty husks drifting in the void. There would be no suffering in their vision of the future, because there would be nothing left to suffer. The Necrons sought to impose their own order on the galaxy. An order based on the supremacy of the mechanical over the organic, of death over life, of stasis over change. They had already achieved their own version of immortality by abandoning flesh for living metal. And they viewed biological life as an aberration to be corrected. Each enemy offered its own form of finality. Each represented a different way for human consciousness to end forever. Against them all stood the Imperium, flawed and brutal and monstrously oppressive, but still the last bastion of human existence. And at its heart, keeping it all together through sheer force of will, sat the Golden Throne. I could feel its presence now in ways that my living mind never could have comprehended. It was not simply a machine or a throne or a life support system. It was a nexus point where multiple dimensions intersected, a place where the Emperor's consciousness could expand beyond the boundaries of single flesh and touch every corner of human space simultaneously. The technology was ancient beyond measure, built during the dark age of technology, when humanity had reached heights of scientific achievement that would not be seen again for tens of thousands of years. It had been designed for a different purpose originally, as a gateway between dimensions, but the Emperor had modified it, adapted it, turned it into something that could sustain his transformed existence. But it was failing. 10,000 years of constant operation had taken their toll. Components that had been designed to last for millennia were breaking down. Systems that had once operated with perfect efficiency were developing flaws, inconsistencies, failures that required ever more psychic energy to overcome. The 1,000 souls sacrificed daily had once been a manageable drain on the Emperor's power. Now they barely sustained him from one day to the next. Soon even that would not be enough. Through the collective consciousness of the Astronomicon, I could perceive the calculations running constantly in the depths of his divine intelligence. Statistical models predicting the rate of decay, probability matrices exploring potential solutions, contingency plans for scenarios too terrible to contemplate. The conclusion was always the same. The Golden Throne would fail within the next few centuries. When it did, the Emperor would die, the Astronomicon would go dark, and humanity would be left alone in a galaxy full of enemies who had been waiting 10,000 years for exactly this moment, unless something changed. I felt his attention turned toward a particular region of space far from Sanctum Prime, where something unprecedented was happening. A human world where the impossible had occurred, where someone had found a way to create new technology that actually worked, that enhanced human capabilities, instead of simply maintaining what already existed. For the first time in 10 millennia, humanity was innovating again. The implications sent ripples through the choir of souls that made up the astro. If this development could be protected, nurtured, allowed to spread, it might represent hope for the future. A way forward that did not depend on the slow decay of ancient systems, or the daily sacrifice of innocence. But it would have to be protected. The forces of chaos had noticed the innovation as well, and they were moving to corrupt it, to turn humanity's new hope into another weapon in their arsenal. Orc fleets were converging on the sector, drawn by the promise of new technology to loot and destroy. Tyranid scout ships probed the outer systems, tasting the genetic diversity that new human colonies represented. The Emperor's will focused like a laser beam on that distant region of space. Power flowed through us, through the Astronomicon, across thousands of light years to manifest as miracle and intervention. Space Marine chapters received visions directing them toward the threatened worlds. Imperial Guard regiments found themselves reinforced by troops who should have been deployed elsewhere. Tech priests discovered ancient STC fragments that had been lost for millennia, giving them the tools they needed to understand and protect the new innovations. The effort was enormous. I felt the strain ripple through every soul in the choir as the Emperor drew on our essence to fuel his intervention. Some of us simply burned out. Our consciousness dissolved completely as our psychic energy was consumed. Others held on but were diminished, reduced to shadows of what we had been. And still, it was not enough. The innovations were spreading, but slowly. The defenses were holding, but barely. The enemy forces were too numerous, too determined, too well coordinated to be stopped by conventional means. Something more was needed. Something that had not been tried in 10,000 years of warfare. I felt the Emperor's consciousness turn inward, focusing on the deepest levels of the Golden Throne, on systems that had not been activated since the Horus Heresy. Ancient protocols that had been designed for the most desperate of circumstances. Powers that he had sworn never to use again because the cost was too terrible to contemplate. But the alternative was worse. The transformation began slowly, so subtly that at first I thought it was simply another fluctuation in the psychic energy flowing through the throne. But gradually, I became aware that something fundamental was changing. The barriers between dimensions were becoming more permeable. The distinction between the material universe and the warp was beginning to blur. Not the chaotic dissolution that the forces of chaos sought to impose, but something controlled, directed, purposeful. The Emperor was transforming the space around Sanctum Prime into something new. A realm where his will could manifest directly, without the need for intermediary systems or psychic conduits. It was glorious. It was terrifying. It was the birth of something that had never existed before in the history of the galaxy. A god ascending to true divinity. The process sent shockwaves through every soul connected to the astral. We felt ourselves being drawn into the transformation. Our individual consciousness becoming part of something vast and sublime and utterly beyond human comprehension. This was not the gradual dissolution we had experienced when first connected to the throne. This was but it came at a price. The power required for such a transformation was beyond what even the daily sacrifice of 1,000 souls could provide. The Emperor was drawing on deeper reserves, tapping into the very foundations of the Golden Throne itself. Systems that had operated flawlessly for 10 millennia began to fail as their energy was redirected toward the great work. and we began to burn. Not the slow, controlled burning that had sustained the Astronomicon for 10,000 years, but a fierce conflagration that consumed everything we were and had ever been. Our memories, our personalities, our individual consciousness, all of it fed into the fires of transformation. I felt Lydia's presence flicker and fade as her essence was consumed. Victor followed moments later, his steady influence suddenly absent from the choir. One by one, the souls I had come to know during our brief existence in the Astronomicon were burned away, their sacrifice fueling something greater than any of us could have imagined. My own dissolution began shortly after. The memories that had defined Darius Kane started to slip away like sand through fingers. My childhood in the lower hive, the pride I had felt in my work at the manufactory, the taste of real food, and the sound of rainfall, and the face of the girl I had loved for 3 perfect weeks. All of it feeding the fire that would remake the galaxy. But even as my individual identity crumbled, I felt something remarkable happening. The boundaries between the souls in the choir were dissolving, but instead of oblivion, we were merging into something new. Not the cold mechanical unity of a hive mind, but a warm organic fusion of consciousness that preserved the best of what each of us had been while creating something infinitely greater. We were becoming part of the Emperor himself, not as servants or tools or sources of energy, but as integral components of his divine consciousness. Our memories became his memories. Our experiences became his experiences. Our humanity became the foundation upon which his godhood was built. And in that moment of ultimate sacrifice, I understood the true purpose of sacred service. We had not been selected to die. We had been selected to live forever as part of something eternal. Every soul that had ever sat in the preparation chambers, every consciousness that had ever been dissolved into the astral, every death that had seemed meaningless and cruel and necessary, all of it had been leading to this moment. The birth of a true god of humanity. The Emperor's transformation rippled outward from Sanctum Prime like a wave of pure will. Across the galaxy, his servants felt the change. Space Marines knelt in sudden reverence as they experienced visions of golden light. Imperial God commanders found themselves blessed with tactical insights that turned certain defeats into miraculous victories. Tech priests discovered that their prayers to the machine god were being answered with unprecedented clarity. And in the distant sector, where humanity's new innovations were struggling to survive, the tide of battle turned. Chaos fleets found their warp drives failing as the very fabric of space-time rejected their presence. Orc warbands discovered that their weapons were misfiring, their war machines breaking down, their instinctive aggression turning inward as they fought among themselves. Tyranid hive ships recoiled from systems that had suddenly become inedible, their bioships unable to process the changed nature of local space-time. The innovations were safe. The future was secured. The price of 10,000 years of sacrifice had finally been paid in full, but the cost had been enormous. The Golden Throne lay silent, its ancient systems finally exhausted by the effort of transformation. The preparation chambers stood empty, their crystalline matrices dark and still. The daily sacrifice of 1,000 souls was no longer necessary, because there was nothing left to sustain. The Emperor had transcended the need for physical existence entirely. He was everywhere now, in every ray of starlight that touched a human world, in every breath drawn by his faithful servants, in every thought that turned toward hope instead of despair. The Astronomicon still burned brighter than ever, but it no longer required souls to fuel its fire. It ran on the pure will of a being who had finally achieved true godhood, and we were part of it. All of us who had given our lives to sacred service over 10 millennia of faithful sacrifice. We existed now as facets of his divine consciousness, each one preserving some small aspect of human experience, each one contributing to the vast tapestry of memory and emotion that kept him connected to the species he had sworn to protect. Darius Kane, factory worker from Sector Delta 5, no longer existed as an individual entity, but his memories lived on in the divine consciousness. His love for the girl whose name had been forgotten, his pride in work well done, his simple human joy in small pleasures. All of it was preserved within something infinitely larger and more important. I was part of God now, and God was part of me. The transformation was not complete. It would take time for the Emperor's new existence to fully manifest across the galaxy. There would still be battles to fight, enemies to defeat, crises to resolve. But the fundamental equation had changed. Humanity was no longer fighting a losing battle against overwhelming odds. For the first time in 10,000 years, there was genuine hope for the future. New technologies would spread unchecked by the forces of stagnation. Human colonies would expand into previously unreachable regions of space. The barriers between the material universe and the warp would strengthen, holding back the forces of chaos more effectively than ever before. There would still be suffering. There would still be death. there would still be the countless small tragedies that marked the human condition across a galaxy of war and hardship. But there would also be progress, growth, the possibility that tomorrow might be better than today. It was worth the price we had paid, worth every soul that had burned to make this moment possible, worth the sacrifice of our individual existence to become part of something eternal. The wheel had turned one final time. The fire had consumed everything and been reborn as something pure and bright and everlasting. The Emperor had transcended mortality and become truly divine, and we, the faithful, who had given everything to make his transformation possible, lived on in his infinite consciousness. Our sacrifice transformed into the foundation of a new age for humanity. The song continued, but it was no longer it had become something else entirely, a hymn of victory, a celebration of sacrifice vindicated, a promise that the light which had guided humanity through its darkest hours would never be extinguished again. In the depths of space, ships found their destinations more isolated than ever before. On distant worlds, colonists looked up at alien skies and saw the Astronomicon burning with renewed strength. In the hearts of the faithful, prayers were answered with a clarity that had not been felt since the Emperor had walked among mortals. The long night was ending. The dawn was finally breaking, and in the golden light of a new age, the souls of the sacrificed sang their eternal song of service and redemption, their individual voices lost in the greater chorus, but their essence preserved forever in the consciousness of the God they had helped to create. Sacred service